Now Thomas Hearns is an open book to Ray Leonard. Backs up against the ropes.
This is one of the most unusual calls by a referee in the history of the sport.
The first loss. A tremendous victory. Leonard fighting off the ropes.
It happened. It happened. Uppercut by Douglas. Down goes Tyson.
Hooks in right hand shot.
Excellent. Knocks out by Tyson.
Slumps to the canvas.
The champion struggles to stay on his feet.
How do you like it? How do you like it?
Welcome, fight fans, to another episode of BTR Boxing Podcast Legendary Nights with me, your host Sean Bastow, shortly to be joined by Johnston Brown for this tale as picked by Johnston Brown. Of course, we had our picks. We had mine a couple of weeks ago, Lewis versus Smelling, and now we've got Johnston pick, which is the tale of Aaron Pryor versus Alexis Arguello. But of course, before we get into the Legendary Nights episode, I want you guys to go and check us out on social media at BTR Boxing Pod on Twitter and BTR Boxing Podcast on Facebook as well. And if you've not already subscribed to the podcast, then what are you doing? Get over there and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or Podbean, Stitcher, Spreaker, Player FM, or even Spotify. Go and check out the new YouTube channel. All the audio versions of the podcast will be on there, shortly to be joined by video versions in the next coming months. So, as selected by our co-host Johnston Brown, this is the tale of Aaron Pryor versus Alexis Arguello.
Peace.
So we're back for another episode of Legendary Nights, which has now got its brand new feed. And if you've not already subscribed to Legendary Nights, please go and check it out on any podcasting app available. Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, you know where to find us. We're on Twitter as well at BTR Boxing Pod and Facebook, BTR Boxing Podcast. Thank you so much to everybody that's been following us and sharing everything that we've been putting out. We really appreciate it. So this is the Legendary Night that's been selected by Johnston. You've selected this Legendary Night as one of them fantastic fights that you've watched from over the years, and it's just an unbelievable fight, marred by a lot of controversy as we go on through the episode and the aftermath, of course, of both of these men. This is the tale of Aaron Pryor versus Alexis Arguello.
And I have to admit, I wasn't even born. 12th of November 1982, I weren't born till the 27th, and it's funny and ironic that I've decided to choose this fight. It is one of the greatest, one of the best fights I've ever seen, and the controversy that surrounded it was, it's all iconic. Everything about the two guys. Alexis Arguello is one of my favourite fighters ever, just the way he fights and his personality. And Aaron Pryor was also another guy that went under the radar of sorts in the 80s because of the Fabulous Four. And these are like, almost like the other six. It's like the Super Six, if you like, when you add these two in. And this fight at the Orange Bowl is just an absolute stunner, and it's one that I'm really pleased that we can finally get in for a legendary night.
I had an absolute great time watching back on this particular fight and looking at the build-up and looking at a young Bob Arum and a Burt Sugar and all these characters that we knew growing up as children in the late 80s and the early 90s, seeing these guys and then seeing them obviously in their older age, and unfortunately some of them are not with us anymore, but it was great to sort of look back on the build-up for how big of a fight this really was back in 1982. And as always with Legendary Nights, we look at the build-up prior to the fight. So we're going to look at the careers of both men leading up to this fight and what led to this significant fight. And then also we'll go into the build-up specifically for the fight. What got these two guys going? Was the controversy? Was the press conference fights? We're going to go into it all, of course, and we're going to tell the tales of it. And then we get into the fight itself. We break down what was one of the greatest fights of the 80s. And then we look at the aftermath. What did this fight mean for boxing? What did this fight mean for both men's careers? How did it all end for them? That's what we're going to go into in this episode. So, of course, we're going to start with Aaron Pryor's career first and foremost. And we're going to look at the significant fights throughout his career and look at the ones that were significant to make his career to the level it got to. And I think, without going too deep into it and deep diving into his career, I think the first significant test in his career came in the late 1970s. And I think when you look back on some of the fights that he was involved in, you've got to look back and see that this guy was an absolute animal. He was an animal, and all the fights have the sort of have the same style. And you look at his career and you look at him and think to yourself, you know, imagine this guy in today's boxing era. And I think going back to his career and looking at the first test of his career, it happened in 1979 for me, 20th of October 1979 against Alfonso Fraser. That was the first big test of his career. He was fighting a very experienced Alfonso Fraser, and he needed a big test, and this was the test.
It was, and Alfonso Fraser was 42, 13 and 3 at the time. Some people would obviously look at the 13 and seem to think that this guy wasn't anywhere near an elite level. He was a fabulous fighter. 13 losses in this time of, you know, late 70s. He went through the whole of the 70s. These guys fought regularly, and unfortunately, you know, sometimes you don't perform your best. And Alfonso Fraser was a good test for Aaron Pryor. And as you say, Aaron Pryor was a beast. I mean, you stuck him in today's era, he would be an absolute animal. I honestly believe he would be the undisputed champion, and there would be no one that can go near him because of just the energy and the amount of punches he would throw. He was just a joy to watch, Aaron Pryor. And Fraser as well was a former world champion and a future world champion, and he was a real seasoned pro. And Aaron Pryor, he got rid of him in 5.
He certainly did get rid of him in 5, and this was what would lead him on then to start what was going to be a great run, really. He'd obviously won all of his fights up until this point, of course, knocking out 17 of the 19 opponents going into the Alfonso Fraser fight. But then he would go on and have one more fight before then going into Miami. So he travelled from Cincinnati to Las Vegas to Miami to Kansas City, and then he would eventually go back to his hometown of Cincinnati for the biggest fight of his career at this point, which was in 1980, the 2nd of August 1980, against Antonio Cervantes for the WBA Super Lightweight Championship of the World.
A few minutes ago here in Cincinnati, a moment of silent prayer in the dressing room of Aaron Pryor, and that is his young son, Aaron Jr. in the foreground. And we're looking now at the challenger. He is in the ring to meet the champion, Antonio Kid Pambale Cervantes of Colombia, now living in Venezuela, making his 21st title appearance. Quite an incredible record. Gil, one of the controversies that sprang up here regarding this fight came from the manager of Aaron Pryor, Buddy La Rosa, who complained that 2 of the judges he considered were Latin American. One indeed is from Venezuela, the other is from Puerto Rico, and the referee is from Los Angeles. They felt that this was going to favor the champion. What effect do you think it'll have on the fight? They were appointed by the WBA, we might add. What effect do you think it'll have on the fight and the fighters?
Well, I feel that's why fighters have managers. If they leave Pryor alone, let him concentrate on Cervantes, I don't think they're going to have to worry about the officials. I think that Pryor can score a knockout.
All right, well, we'll see what happens here and whether indeed it does have any effect if the fight goes the distance.
Antonio Cervantes, what a fantastic fighter he was, Colombian guy. The fight is on YouTube. The actual fight was actually shown on CBS. Cervantes had lost to great fighters like Loche, the Argentinian, Jimenez, Jesus, one of our guys that obviously had the trilogy with Duran, and Benitez. Benitez was a young teenage guy that had beaten Cervantes, and Cervantes, he knew that what Pryor was about, and the crazy thing with Aaron Pryor up to this point, 25 fights. The trouble with Pryor was he was a danger. You're probably going to get beaten by him, and you're not going to earn a lot of money. And Pryor only earned 50 grand in this fight. But what a fight. And as I say, if anyone hasn't seen it, YouTube, this is for the WBA and the Ring light welterweight titles. And Pryor was put down in the first round. And he gets up almost instantly, and he's rolling his arm around. And it's like Cervantes, he must have known it was just danger. You put Pryor down, it meant nothing. Pryor's getting straight back up, and he's going to get right on your chest, and he's going to look to knock you out. That's exactly what he did. He ended up knocking Cervantes out in the 4th.
Pryor took a right hand counter-punching from the champion.
And the referee called it a knockdown.
Yes,
His glove
he did.
hit the canvas.
And I thought it was, too. Well, he didn't catch him clean, but it was enough to send him down.
Well, the rule says any part of your body but your feet hits the canvas, it's a knockdown, and his glove did go down.
He took the mandatory 8 count, but came out showing that he wasn't hurt at all, and I really don't think he was. Counter-punching right hand landed from Cervantes, but Pryor just right back with pressure.
Just seems to brush them off him, and he's changing his direction as he moves in, and that's confusing Cervantes.
Also jabbing pretty well for a guy that's considered a slugger. He's getting to that cut, and he landed a good combination.
I told you, Pryor's a good finisher, Tim.
He's got him down.
Good finisher.
A good punch. Tremendous right hand. Looked like an uppercut that sent the champion to the canvas, and he's trying to shake the cobweb. He might not make it up. He does not. It's all over. There is a new junior welterweight champion, the hometown hero, Aaron
and he won his first world title. And this was really the first. It was, as you say, it was the biggest fight of his career, and it really put him on the map and made people realise that Aaron Pryor is no joke, and he's here to stay, and he's going to be a right threat for any of the welterweights that are around at the time.
So the next significant fight for me in his career came just not too many months afterwards. In November of 1980, he would make his first major payday, $100,000. So equate that to what today's money is. You're probably looking anything between $500,000 to $750,000, maybe even more. That was just a complete guesstimate. So $100,000 for fighting Gaetan Hart, defending his WBA super lightweight title. Again, back in Cincinnati, back at the Riverfront Coliseum, defending his title in emphatic fashion, getting that victory, stopping Hart within 6 rounds. And for me, it just solidified him that at that time as one of the great super lightweights of that era. He started becoming this guy that he was well known. Obviously in Cincinnati he was well known. He was well known for what he was achieving in the ring. But it wasn't going to be long before these big fights were going to come creeping up, and the likes of the Sugar Ray Leonards and the Roberto Durans, who were also doing significantly well at this point in their careers. As you were talking about at the top of the show, his career was overshadowed by the Fab Four, and that is true, because you look at the popularity of Aaron Pryor as a fighter, and then you look at the popularity of the other two that I've mentioned in particular, and he was struggling to sort of get to that $100,000, and you had Duran and you had Leonard, who were making a hell of a lot of more money just in a few fights down the line. I think for Ray Leonard, he came out of the Olympics obviously earning fantastic amounts of money straight away, and then you had Duran, who built his way up and started earning mega money, and then for Aaron Pryor, seemingly the guy who was sort of left behind a little bit by these fighters, was starting to make that level of money and that level of popularity. So he gets that victory then in late 1980 over Gaetan Hart, makes his first $100,000.
And what you were just saying there in terms of the disappointment for him was the fact that he did miss out in the 1976 Olympics. He lost out to Howard Davis, and the crazy thing was, obviously, we know that 1976 Olympics was a fantastic Olympics for America and had some tremendous fighters with the Spinks brothers, with Leonard, Howard Davis being another guy. He was on a reserve list and didn't manage to get back in. And obviously, we all know how great they all became. But, the fact is that he ended up becoming Howard Davis' sparring partner for pretty much Howard Davis' career. And Howard Davis, if you threw the name Howard Davis and Aaron Pryor, many people today, people would say, who's Howard Davis? But we all know who Aaron Pryor is. And the crazy thing was, Howard Davis has earned millions of dollars. $1 million he earned in one of his first sort of 3 or 4 fights. And, like you say, and then you get Pryor only earning $100,000 against Hart. But it was this win that really brought about a big name. And it was in December 1980. And it was looking like Sugar Ray Leonard. And actually, Pryor rejected $500,000 to fight Sugar Ray Leonard for the WBC Welterweight Championship because he wanted more money. When the WBC raised the amount to $750, or probably Leonard's team, he rejected that as well. Instead, he decided to sign to fight the WBC light welterweight champion, who was Saul Mamby, for a unification bout, and that was going to earn him $1 million. However, the fight fell through, basically down to his promoter, Howard Smith, who had disappeared amid allegations that he had been involved in $21.3 million worth of fraud against the Wells Fargo National Bank. So Smith, whose real name actually ended up being Ross Fields, was later sentenced to 10 years in prison and was convicted on 29 counts of fraud and embezzlement. So Pryor ended up rejecting Sugar Ray Leonard for the fight he really wanted, in actual fact thinking he's going to get a unification bout at light welterweight or super lightweight, however you want to say it, and earning $1 million, and it all fell through. So bless him, it ended in disappointment. But it was a light at the end of the tunnel, because Roberto Duran was looking like that was going to happen, $750,000 in April 1981. But again, Pryor turned it down, and it was down to the fact that I believe he was waiting to get a new contract sorted out with his manager, who was Buddy LaRosa. By the time they eventually agreed, had a new agreement in place, Duran had moved on. And in actual fact, I think, did he fight? Was it Was it Hagler? I can't. We may even have been Hearns. I can't quite remember. But he ended up getting a bigger fight, Duran. So he missed out on Roberto Duran, and he also missed out on Sugar Ray Leonard.
So that was in a short period of time of around 5 months. So you're looking at the Gaetan Hart fight happened on the 22nd of November 1980. December was obviously the Sugar Ray Leonard incident where they were talking about that fight. You fast forward to 1981. In April of 1981, this is when he's given the opportunity to fight Duran, who then eventually moves on because of the legal issues that you were talking about regarding contracts. So them two huge names that people will talk about Aaron Pryor as never having fought, or people that he should have fought in his career. He missed out on both of them. The first time because he decided he didn't want to take it because he didn't feel he was getting offered enough money. The second time because of obviously legal issues and contractual obligations. He missed out on two of the biggest names of that generation. It's such a shame that over that short 5-month period between 80 and 81 that he wasn't able to get any of them two fights signed, because for me, win, lose or draw any of them two fights, and he would have been remembered, as you rightly said, that he could have been put in there as part of a Fab 5 or even a Fab 6 if you include Aguero as well. But that would have been, for me, that would have solidified his legacy. And that is what is disappointing when you look back on the history of it and you look back at them short 5 months. Why he never took that first Ray Leonard fight and the offer, I wouldn't know. I really would love to have known why he didn't take that fight at the time, because there was a lot of money being offered. So he'd gone from 100 grand to being offered 750 grand, which again probably equates to a couple of million in this day and age. So I bet that's one thing, that he definitely regretted. I'm sure that would have been something that he regretted. And it's interesting because obviously as we come on to another story in a few moments about Sugar Ray Leonard and Aaron Pryor, it'll be interesting to know what would have happened in that fight should it have gone down. So then he comes back and he faces Lennox Blackmore 27th of June 1981, beats Lennox Blackmore, and then goes into another defence against Johnston in November of 1981. Again, going back to one of his earlier fights, we're talking about how ferocious his style was. He comes out again, out the blocks. You can't help himself, can he? He just comes running out. He likes to take a few, to give a few. And what happens again? He gets dropped in round number 1.
Duan Johnson, known in Detroit circles around the crowd as Mr. Excitement.
The way Pryor's moving around the ring, I've never seen this before. I think he's trying to warm himself up. This could be the case here.
Well, Johnson goes to the attack and lands a combination to the head of Pryor. Gets a smile back from the champion.
You may see an early knockdown, Tony.
There it is, right there. Johnson. As Ray Leonard called that literally a second before now. Pryor saying, I'm fine, gets right up and goes after Duan Johnson, and that's what we expected too.
Remember, Tim, they were both going to box. Both guys were going to box. Now look what they're doing.
He did. Duan Johnson was actually undefeated, 70-0 at the time, and that's just Pryor's style. He was never gonna. He's never gonna be a guy that's gonna be cautious at the start. The way he sees it is he's gonna attack a guy from the off. He's gonna put him under pressure. And most of the time they wilted, and this was at the time where he was on this fantastic run. He was just knocking everybody out. Everybody was facing. It was incredible. And Johnson was on the unfortunate side of another KO loss, which was in the 7th round. He then obviously went on to fight Miguel Montilla. He also, again, another knockout, 12th round of 15 on March 21st, 1982. And it was at this point that Pryor signed to face Sugar Ray Leonard. He actually signed to face Sugar Ray Leonard after the Montilla fight for the undisputed welterweight championship in the fall of 1982 for $750,000. So he finally did get that big signing on, that big name and that big purse. So he was happy, obviously, over the moon. And on the May 14, 1982, I think that was when it was scheduled to happen. So the Sunday before the bout where Leonard was supposed to fight and defend his title out in Buffalo, it was that Sunday that Pryor decided to drive to Buffalo from Cincinnati, and he went there to taunt Leonard, just to hype the fight. And if anyone knows Aaron Pryor, they will know that he loves it all. What time is it? Hot time. And he had his whole entourage with him. He had a great persona, and people like to be around him from what I've read and what I've heard. So Pryor, on the way to Buffalo to just wind Leonard up, he hears on his car radio the news that Leonard had actually suffered a detached retina in his left eye, and the fight was off. And he actually said his actual words were, "I pulled off the side of the road and I cried." And basically that was it. Leonard retired 6 months later, and he never got that big fight.
Crazy, isn't it? Like, that is a story where you think to yourself, like, what could have been? And I think the story that we've not included is the sparring story. The one of the most famous stories is about the fact that they sparred each other, and how initially, when they got in the ring, Ray Leonard started to get the better of Aaron Pryor first and foremost, and then Aaron Pryor started to turn it around, and as he got into sort of the second and the third round, that's where Pryor started to turn it on, and he started to actually hurt Leonard, and as a result of that, Leonard's trainer said, "No, that's it, sparring's done, it's over," as Pryor was supposedly bossing Ray Leonard in sparring behind closed doors. So that was quite interesting. That was something that made me think, just imagine if that fight would have happened, and 2 disappointments of the Ray Leonard fight and one of the Duran fight. And people have said about Aaron Pryor, when I've spoke to people about him and about his career, and you get people that make their own comments on social media about him. Yeah, he's fantastic. Yeah, he had a really, really good career. He had some significant fights. This legendary night we're covering is the defining one for his career. But he never faced Ray Leonard, or he never faced Duran, or he never got to go with Hearns. And people always talk about that, about his career. But then when you go deeper into it, and you look at the fact that he was so close to getting that big fight with Sugar Ray Leonard. He'd signed for it this time. He'd accepted the money. He's driving down to go and watch Ray Leonard in his fight against Roger Stafford. He's going to go and taunt him. He's going to be ringside. He's going to get a few tips about what he can do in the ring against him. He's signed to fight him later that year. That happens, and he hears about it on the radio of all places. So it's not even like he's been told by anybody. Like, you know, you don't have the social media to tell you this in 1982. You don't have, mobile phones to tell you this in 1982. You're literally driving down the road on the way there. He's probably thinking, yeah, I'm going to give this guy some shit. I'm going to say this about him. I'm going to say that about him. And then all of a sudden, excitement just turns to misery in a matter of seconds after hearing that radio broadcast. And as you said, he rightly did talk about the fact that he pulled over and literally cried in his car, and that massively mentally affected him. But it wouldn't affect his career, of course, because this is where we lead into the Arguello fight. He had one more fight before we get into the Arguello fight, which was against Akio Kameda, and defended his title yet again. And then this is where now we're going to switch over and we're going to move into the career of Alexis Arguello, of course, before we lead into the build-up for this fight. So when you talk about Alexis Arguello, then you talk about a guy who was an amazing fighter, a 3-weight world champion, potentially could have been a 4th-weight world champion, a guy that went into exile into the USA, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, a guy that just had a legendary career. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that legendary career came about. And the first thing we're going to look at is the fact that he turned pro all the way back in 1968. He turned professional 1968. So before he got in the ring with Aaron Pryor, he had an already long career leading up to that, and I think it was significant to talk about the fact that his career would consist of some amazing names. And as we go through the course of his career, you're going to talk about guys that he went in to beat, who ended up then going on to become champions, which I found quite amazing to know that he actually is more of a legend than maybe what people think he is, because he's beating guys that ended up going on to become champions later on down the line, which I think is a really good part of his resume, which is underrated. So I think the first big fight for him really came on the 16th of February 1974. So at this point, he'd amassed a record of 31 wins with 3 victories and 26 by way of knockout, and he fought for the WBA Featherweight Championship of the World against Ernesto Marcel. So this was his first big test. 15-round fights back then as well, remember. So we were not got the standard 12 that we got today, 15-round fights, and that's one thing will come across throughout Arguello's career, is that he was genuinely a natural 15-round fighter. That is something that you don't say a lot about fighters. Obviously, in this last couple of generations, this is a guy who was naturally gifted and naturally had the endurance and stamina to go the full 15 rounds. So he would go in there against Ernesto Marcel, and he would actually lose his first attempt at a world title. It was a tough fight for him, that. And I think that was the one where he learnt a hell of a lot in that fight to take him into what would end up being a legendary career.
Absolutely, and Alexis Arguello, as I said at the top of the show, he really is one of my favourite fighters, not just the way he was in the ring, but his persona outside of it. He was, for me, just sort of, recently I run through sort of all the divisions and tried to sort of pick my top 10 across the divisions. It was it was pretty hard to do. But for me, he's one of the best super featherweights that's ever lived. He really is, and he is sort of overshadowed by some great fighters at lightweight, obviously, but an excellent fighter at lightweight. He had absolutely no problems fighting southpaws, which is something we'll come into, but obviously this was a big fight for him. He's obviously taken on, is it Ernesto Marcel, and it was a Panamanian Marcel, and he won the title from a Venezuelan guy called Antonio Gomez in 1972, and was only ever stopped by the great and the legend and the greatest ever lightweight. We've also done a career profiles on. Have a listen. Is Roberto Duran. His experience was just too much for Aguero at the time in 1974, and Aguero ended up losing on points, as you rightly said. And one thing Marcel said after the fight is Aguero has a strong punch and is a good boxer. Someday he will be a champion, and he weren't wrong.
No, he certainly weren't. He certainly weren't. So, in 1974, he had another 4 fights after this Marcel defeat, which would be essentially the making of him, because then he would go into later on in 1974, specifically the 23rd of November, and he would go in against another legendary fighter by the name of Ruben Olivares. Now, Ruben Olivares was a guy that had been around, obviously, for a long time leading up to this particular fight, but he'd actually won the WBA title in July of 1974 because Ernesto Marcel actually vacated the title after his victory over Alexis Arguello. So he vacated the title, and then Ruben Olivares won the title in July of 1974 and then defended it against Aguero. And this would be a significant really for him, because this would be the moment where he gets crowned a champion. And just to put a bit of context to Ruben Olivares was a bantamweight legend. If you've not seen any of his fights, when he was down at the bantamweight division, he was an absolute legend. He won. Again, he's a guy we could probably do a career profile on, and people will think to themselves, who's Ruben Olivares? Who is this guy? He's a legend. Bantamweight and featherweight champion. The guy moved up through the weights and won 2 championships. For me, was one of the great fighters of all time. That he's probably underrated by a lot of people because they probably don't know who he is. So if you've not heard about Ruben Olivares, then go and check this guy out. A fantastic fighter. But as we was talking about a little bit earlier about how Aguero is an endurance man, a man of stamina, this was a really back and forth fight, and it went all the way into the 13th round. This was where inevitably the endurance would come through, and this is where you'd start to see Aguero as that endurance fighter, because he would take Olivares to the 13th round. After the first few rounds of the fight, he's struggling a little bit. He's doing his usual counter-punching techniques against Olivares, and then all of a sudden gets into the 13th. He's kept that stamina in the bank, and he's absolutely unleashed a flurry of combinations and ends up going on to stop Olivares in the 13th round, successfully then picking up his first world title. That was the significant start to his career. This was the start of his free weight reign, and this for me was probably, before some of the other fights that we'll talk about, this was probably one of them legacy-defining fights. I like to call them legacy-defining fights because these are the ones that set off a trend and set off a pattern of things that will go down in history, and this was one of them for me.
Round 13. He ran into a solid left hook. 8, 9, Olivares is up. Arguello might pull off a huge upset here as Olivares was stunned, ran right into a left hook. Arguello gets no life. Olivares ran into a solid left hook that floored him, but he's coming back. There's a long way to go, only 1 minute. Dick Young, 7, 8, 9, it's over. Ladies and gentlemen, the time, 1 minute, 20 seconds into round number 13, scoring the win by knockout, and no, featherweight champion of the world, Alexis Arguello.
I couldn't agree with you more. And this was, and Ruben Oliveira's, as you say, as a bantamweight was just brilliant. And then maybe it was a matter of going through the divisions and moving up to featherweight, fighting a natural featherweight, probably a bit bigger than a featherweight, as we know he moves on through the weight, Aguero. So I think Ruben Oliveira's, I think it was a matter of age and a matter of the fact that he's probably gone a weight too far. I thought a natural featherweight. Saying that, I mean, as you say, today, this is a 15 round. As you say, today, it would have ended in 12 rounds. And if it had have ended in 12 rounds, Oliveira would have won the fight. He was ahead on the scorecard. So it just shows you that these, at the time, how important for some of these guys these 15 rounders were. And it was only in the next round, the 13th round, when they both landed literally simultaneously on each other. And it was the left hook in the 13th that Aguero landed that really hurt Oliveira. Yeah, he hit the deck and that was it. And even Aguero after the fight, he said, I was fighting for my life. And Oliveira hurt me in the 8th, the 9th and the 10th rounds. I felt like I might go down in the 10th. This is a very happy and proud day for myself and my country.
It certainly was a proud day for himself and his country, because he made the country of Nicaragua proud. He'd become a featherweight champion. It was just the start of a legendary reign. So between 1974 and 1977, Arguello would fight 16 times, 5 of which were defences of this featherweight crown. So he goes for 3 years being featherweight champion, fighting all different names through boxing history, and then gets into 1978. So he moves up to super featherweight in 1978, and this is where he then becomes a 2-weight world champion in what was an absolute war with Alfredo Escalera. This was a fight that, if you've not watched, is a YouTube fight. If you're going to go onto YouTube and watch a fight after listening to this episode, as well as watching the main fight that we're talking about, go and watch this one, because this was an absolute bloody war. This was a battle. This was certainly one of them fights that, again, was underrated. Unless you were from that generation and you're listening to this now and you was alive during that generation, you'll know that this was an absolutely amazing fight. But for the benefit of those who wasn't, like ourselves, who have got to look back on the footage, this was one of them that you should go back and watch. You really should go back and watch this. This fight was so significant. It was actually named the Bloody Battle of Bayamon. Escalera actually ended up with a broken nose and cuts over his eye and cuts on his mouth as well. And that was why it was billed Bloody Battle of Bayamon, because of how bloody this fight was. It was significant because not only would this end up becoming a second weight world title for Arguello, but he would go in there and he would pick up that second world weight title and go on to be able to continue on this legendary run. And this was something you were talking about how he was an amazing super featherweight and how much he did at super featherweight. This was the start of it. Beating Escalera was amazing, because Escalera had been the champion for 3 years in the lead up to that fight. He'd been the champion from 1975 to 1978. So he wasn't a mug, he wasn't a slouch. He was an amazing fighter himself, and he's a fighter you should go back and have a quick look on, because he's one that certainly had his own reputable nights. And this was one of them, even though he came out on the wrong side of it and Aguero stopped him within 13 rounds. This, for me, was an amazing night for him. This was the night where, again, legacy defining. You can't really name it anything other than legacy defining, because we're talking about it. We look back in the history books, we look back on the footage, and we look at it and think, this was one of them fights that you can't not help but look back on.
He is sending Aguero to the neutral corner. The cut under Aguero's right eye. McCanny is worried about the cut on the upper lip. He's asked the ring doctor. They are going to stop this fight. They're going to stop this fight, and even as was the case when he knocked out Olivares in the 13th round to become the featherweight champion. Now they stop the fight in the 13th round, and it's a technical knockout for Alexis Arguello. He becomes the junior lightweight champion of the world.
It really was a fantastic fight, and both were a bloody mess. I mean, Alexis Arguello didn't really, I think a cut opened up sort of late in the fight, whereas Escalera had to sort of fight on with the damage to him. It was brutal, and it was an absolute stunning fight. And one thing, I mean, Aguero, you know, he was just he was a bit of a slow starter, Aguero. He liked to take his time and he was patient. I suppose that's a better way of putting it. He was a patient starter. He wasn't nothing like Aaron Pryor, who was just a machine. Whereas, you know, Aguero just eased his way into fights, and then he would gradually get better round by round. And this was no different. But Escalera took a bit of a pounding. Obviously, it was in Puerto Rico, though. He was Puerto Rican, and also he fought at his home. So the Puerto Ricans were backing him. Of course, it was promoted by our old pal, Sean, as well, Don King. Another great fight by the lad. I mean, you can't knock him, the amount of fights this guy puts together. I mean, the amount of legendary nights that have Don King in is remarkable, really. But basically, Howard Cosell as well, actually, he said this is the worst and the most bloodiest, brutal fights he had ever seen in history since Henry Cooper fought Muhammad Ali up at the old Arsenal in the second fight. So you can imagine, if anyone ever see that fight, I'm sure most people would have. It's just as bloody as that. It's a mess. I mean, the footage on YouTube, sometimes it's difficult to really work out how bad it was, but you can tell. I mean, you can see there's a couple of times they had zoom in, you can see it was a mess, and then eventually it stopped. But the main talking point at the time was the other current, well, obviously this being super featherweight, you know, the weight above was the lightweight, and who was the lightweight king? Mr. Roberto Duran, and he was the guy that was running things. So, and you had the super featherweight, the new champion, Aguero, and it was actually, I think it was Angelo Dundee that said that he thought that Aguero might be the only fighter that could beat Duran at lightweight. So that was the incentive. That was the hope that finally Aguero would fight a big name in Duran. Saying that, I mean, Oliveira's and Escalera's two great names, and an excellent fight. And obviously, they would fight again, which we'd also mention further on.
So, just touching on the lightweight division and touching on, obviously, Duran being the king of the lightweight division, it was interesting because late 1978, you know, he decides to move up a weight, and he decides to go one step further and move to lightweight. So he goes to Madison Square Garden in New York. It's in July, it's in the summer, decides to go to lightweight and test the waters there. At this point, he's still the WBC super featherweight champion, still holds that title. It's not like he's been stripped of that title. In this day and age, he's probably have been stripped of that title as soon as he won it. As soon as he won it, he would have been stripped of it. He would have been made to defend it within a number of days. But saying that, it's the WBC, so maybe he would have been made a champion in recess. So at this point, in particular, he moves up to fight Villamir Fernandez. Now, Villamir Fernandez is probably not a familiar name to most of the listeners, but for anybody who's an avid boxing historian, you will know that he did actually lose to Duran for the WBA lightweight title in 1977. And then later on down the line, post the fight with Alexis Arguello, we then go on to lose to Howard Davis, who we spoke about a little bit earlier, and he'd also lose to Hilmer Kente, who was a WBA champion in the lightweight division at that time as well, and that was in 1980. So his second attempt at a world title ended in defeat, so he wasn't no slouch. So this was the opportunity for Alexis Arguello to move up and test them waters, and this would be where we talk about when people take it a step too far. But it was an interesting story, really, when you look at Arguello's career, because it wasn't really. He did lose the fight to Fernandez. He had a 10-rounder. It was a majority decision victory for Fernandez. And then you think to yourself, if you're a fan at this point, you're probably thinking, maybe stay down at your best weight, which is super feather. You're a dominant super featherweight champion. Obviously, as we go on through the story, we'll hear about him moving back up again. But this was significant because, for me, he steps up, he loses in majority decision. It's only a 10-rounder. He is a stamina fighter. He is a long-distance fighter. Maybe that was the difference on the night. And I think if you do go back and have a look at that, I think you'll see that it is. And that was the mistake that was made in this one. It was a calculated risk, but it didn't pay off. But it was significant in the sense that, would we see him stay at lightweight, or would we see him go back down? Well, he would. He'd move back down. He'd go back down and defend his super featherweight title instead. Yeah,
and that's a great point. I think that is exactly what it was. He went in to test the water, and the fact that it was a 10-rounder, maybe Fernandez, maybe his team pushed that and said, we ain't going to go 15 with Aguero, and it was the right move because, as I say, Aguero would have a few, maybe like the first 5 rounds, but he would almost feel his way into the fight. And it sounds strange today when you talk about 12 rounders because almost you're halfway through. So maybe it wouldn't have been a nice time for him to have fought. It was the perfect time to fight in the era that he was in, which is the late 70s and then going into the 80s. So I think that was what it was. I think more than the weight anyway. But I think in his mind, deep down, he probably wanted to just test the water because obviously Duran was around. And I thought, for me personally, I think they mention it as well. And I think they say that, you know, this was a fight for him to see how he got on. Unfortunately, it's a 10-man. If it had gone 15, who knows? But he did move on. He beats Leon in 78. And then he gets the Escalara, the second fight, which is another excellent fight, which also ended in the 13th round. It's actually the Ruben Olivares, he finishes him in the 13th. Escalara, first fight, 13th. Escalara's second fight, 13th, finished him off in Italy. So it was a bit of it was unlucky for Aguero, that's for sure. And he was on fire that night, and it was just another stunning left hand. It was a left hand that floored Escalara, who tried to get back up to his feet, but he ended up sort of falling back into his corner. The on-the-site doctor after that sort of had a little look at him, but Aguero, he ended up calling it off. It ended basically. I think it was to do with the doctor. I can't remember precisely. I'm sure it was the doctor that called it off in the end. And funny enough, story was the on-the-site doctor wanted Aguero after the fight to go to the hospital because he actually had a cut, quite a serious cut. So Aguero had a flight to catch from Rome the very next day. So he decided that he's not gonna. So in the end, he didn't want to go to the hospital. So in the end, he boarded a train from a place called Rimini, which I'm guessing that was where the fight was. And the doctor actually decided to travel with Aguero and perform plastic surgery on Aguero's cuts while Aguero was awake. So that just shows you how much of a fucking absolute Trojan that geezer was. He didn't give a shit. I got a flight to catch her. I got a train. Instead, actually, just get on a train and then just do me cuts on the train. And that's basically what he did. And that just says a lot about Aguero and what he was like as a person.
Oh, I'll tell you what, he was one-eyed bastard, wasn't he? He was having his he was having his eye surgically put back together, and he's just casually reading the paper, probably on the train, to go and catch his flight. It's ridiculous. Just goes to show you how much of a crazy guy he really was, and a hard man he really was as well. So yeah, you talk about the Escalara fight, gets the victory, and then he moves on to. I would say the next fight is significant, but I'd say more the aftermath and the controversy surrounding this next particular fight was what would set the events of Arguello's life and his family's life and the way things would go for him over the next few years. So his next fight then, he goes in to defend his WBC super featherweight title in New York against Rafael Limon. So Rafael Limon, another great fighter, another fighter on Alexis Arguello's resume, who would actually go on to be a two-time world champion after the fight with Aguero, which is what I was referring to earlier when I was talking about a few of them champions and a few of them guys on his resume who would go on to do great things in their own careers respectively. So at the time, you had a crisis going on in his home country of Nicaragua. So you had governments which were opposing each other, and you had a dictatorship going on, and then you had a particular group which were called the Sandinista National Liberation Front. As the fight is just about to take place, Aguero's in the ring. He then gets draped with this flag of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, and he's draped in it. And they essentially see that as a bit of a... They don't see it as support anyway, put it that way. They don't see that as a supporting contribution. They see that as he's opposing us here. We don't like that. So he goes in and he beats Rafael Limon, gets the victory over him, defends his title yet again. But then, just a few short days later, this fight took place on the 8th of July, 11 days later on the 19th of July. After Aguero had obviously got this victory, defended his title yet again, the Sandinista National Liberation Front confiscated around $500,000 worth of Aguero's assets, forcing the family to go into exile to the USA.
Yep, and from 1979, exactly, he had to move to Miami. He took his family and he moved out there. And Miami at the time had a strong Hispanic heritage. It was a place where Duran went after Lamas as well. So, that just shows you he felt welcome in Miami. And Alexis Arguello was pretty much the same. And they accepted him in open arms and they adored him. And he ended up becoming a hero in Miami within the Hispanic sort of heritage and those that were Hispanic in the area. And yeah, he had his house seized and they took over the Sandinista party, socialist political party. They ended up exiling him, as well as many others as well. So Aguero was unable to return home, and And, you know, Lemon was a great fight, as you say. You know, one thing I will say is Rafael Lemon, just going off on a side note, Rafael Lemon had fought Bobby Shacon twice already before this fight, and he had won and drawn one, and they actually had another couple of fights after, and they are 4 brilliant fights, and it maybe it's a tale we should look at doing for Legendary Nights. But Lemon was a fantastic fighter, southpaw, and he got rid of him in America in the 11th, not the 13th this time. But then he moved on to fight Bobby Shacon, a.k.a. the schoolboy, obviously in exile, living in Miami now. He went on another fight that's also on YouTube. Bobby was a former and future world champion, a lot like Lemon. Another brilliant fight where Shacon went down in the 7th and the referee ended up stopping the fight. But another great fight. And it just, this is where I was, in terms of super featherweight. I honestly cannot, I mean, the only person, I hate to say it, that I could probably say could match Alexis Arguello at super featherweight would be someone like a Floyd Mayweather Jr. He's the only guy. Because, you know, Floyd Mayweather Jr. for me at super featherweight was brilliant, and lightweight, I thought that was the best. But that would have been a fantastic fight. Who knows what could have happened. But here's me going off on the side note. But yeah, Lemon, then Shacon, and then it moved on. And we had another couple of fights after that before fighting another southpaw in Rolando Navarrete in the 27th of April 1980.
So that was another victory over yet again another fighter who would eventually go on to become a world champion, adding another future world champion to his resume. So, you know, you're looking at 3 to 4, well, maybe more, about 4 to 5, either former world champions or future world champions on his resume there. And that, again, starts to tell you the depths of this guy's resume and this guy's boxing career. And this is before this legendary night. So he's done all this before we get to this fight with Aaron Pryor, which is crazy. When you look at it like that, most fighters would dream to have that career twice over. But yet, Alexis Arguello at this point has already had that career, hasn't he? And that's what's crazy about it. So, obviously, he gets that win over Navarrete, and then it's where he decides he wants to start to go test the water again, moves back up to lightweight, and has fights with Cornelius Edwards, Jose Luis Ramirez, Robert Vasquez, and then the next significant fight in his career for me was against Scotland's very own Jim Watt, who was at the time the WBC lightweight champion of the world. And Jim Watt was a great fighter in his own right. You know, we all remember Jim Watt for his time as a pundit on Sky. Most of us from this sort of last couple of generations just remember some of the sayings that he would use to say on Sky Sports. But people forget that this guy was a legitimate champion, a legitimate world champion, a great world champion. And a name that popped up earlier on the episode was a guy that came from that 1976 Olympics, Howard Davis Jr. He'd actually defend his lightweight title against Howard Davis Jr. in 1980 successfully, and also ending his undefeated run of 13 fights at the time. So he, in 1981, was the WBC lightweight champion, which is where Alexis Arguello comes in, of course, and Alexis Arguello goes the full 15 rounds with Jim Watt, but then dethrones him via a unanimous decision. And this is the first time he's came over to UK as well. So he's at the Empire Pool at Wembley. So he'd come over, he picked up the victory, and he became a 3-weight world champion by beating Jim Watt.
The judges' scores are as follows. Dick Young scores 147 for Arguello, 137 for Watt.
A massive win for Aguero on the first judges' cards.
Scores 147 for Aguero, 143 for Watt.
Aguero is the new champion.
Judge Albert, 147 for Aguero, 143 for Watt.
It's a unanimous decision, and Alexis Arguello, 29 years old, is the new WBC lightweight champion.
Yes, and the other thing to mention is with all these guys, Lemon, southpaw, Navarrete, southpaw, Jose Edwards, southpaw, Jose Luis Ramirez, southpaw, and obviously Jim Watt, southpaw. Not only did he fight southpaws, but he also travelled to Puerto Rico, he travelled to Italy, and as you rightly say, come over here to fight Jim Watt. This is why I absolutely love Alexis Arguello. The guy didn't care who he fought, he just wanted to make sure, he wanted to fight the best and to prove that he was the best. And the reason why he was such a great fighter, where he could actually fight these southpaws, where today you'd see so many guys avoid southpaws, it was just the way he would throw that right hand. He would have his left foot and he would just he would always have it on the outside. His footwork is immense when he fought southpaws. It was just perfect for him. and he would throw that right hand, and it just caused a world of trouble. And Jim Watt, well, he was in a lot of trouble basically, and he did take a bit of a mauling over the 15 rounds. But Jim Watt, to his credit, 38-7 at the time. It was his last ever fight as well. But he was a warrior, Jim Watt. And I do you know what? I didn't know it at the time when he used to commentate. Sometimes he would take laugh at me sometimes. But I took it upon myself to go back a couple of years ago and just have a look at Jim Watt. And he was a great lightweight. He really was. And as you say, winning those titles, and it was his fifth defence of the title after winning it in 1979. And he did take a pasting. And actually, he was after the fight what kept his humour and the respect for Alexis Arguello. And that was the other thing with Alexis Arguello. He would go to his place, he'd go to Puerto Rico against a Puerto Rican, and the fans are all Puerto Rican, but he'd walk away from a fight where they would love him. And the one thing we didn't mention, just in terms of the way he'd beat the crap out of somebody, and afterwards he'd go over and give them a cuddle and shake their hands and take them out for a pint. He was that type of fella. And Jim Watt, as I say, he came over here, he battered Jim Watt. He went in here, obviously, as he would have been the favourite. People knew who Aguero was, with the hope that Watt would win the fight. He didn't. Got panned in, and Jim Watt did come out and say, I have a car business, and if I was to do an estimate on my face, I'll probably write it off. So that just says a lot about how much of a mess Jim Watt was in. But after the fight, once again, Alexis Arguello walks away from another country where we all loved him, and the Brits did from that point. The Brits looked at for Alexis Arguello, and then after that we had the Ray Mancini fight, and I'll let you talk about Ray Mancini because it just describes how much of a lovely guy Alexis Arguello was.
It certainly did, and just touching back on that victory over Jim Watt, this made him the 6th fighter in boxing history at this point to become a freeweight world champion, and only the 2nd Latin American fighter to become a freeweight world champion, with the other one being Wilfred Benitez. So there you go. That just goes to show you what level of fighters he was in a company with. So the Ray Mancini fight then, as you rightly pointed out, that was his next fight. That was another great win for him. And I say it was a great win because, this is a guy who would take on all comers. He would travel around to fight anybody, as you rightly just pointed out. And he would do it with, great respect. And he would do it with great passion, and he would do it with humbling words after fights, and the things he would do for fighters. So he would go in there and he would defend his title successfully against Ray Mancini, stopping Ray Mancini in 14 rounds. But it wasn't this that was the highlight of this particular night for me. The highlight of the night, after beating an undefeated Ray Mancini, was to get Mancini in the ring at the end. And basically, when he's being interviewed by the broadcasters at the time, he said he would do anything for Ray Mancini's dad, who at the time was quite ill at ringside and wanted to see his son become a world champion. And unfortunately, that wasn't the night. But the way Aguero would talk about his father, who was sat there at ringside, who he would address in that interview, was, for me, just going to show the type of man that he was. And I think that particular interview was where it skyrocketed his popularity with fans across the world, especially in America. Obviously, he was an adopted American at this point. They'd had him over there for a couple of years. He was in exile over in America. But yeah, he was this Nicaraguan fighter who had won the hearts and minds of millions of people just because of a few words that he said, because it was genuine and it was from the heart.
Arguello is with us here. Alexis, a really tremendous, magnificent championship performance. I know that you expected to get a very tough fight from Ray Mancini. Was he everything you expected?
Well, I told him from the beginning, I had the best condition in my life because I knew it. Mancini is one of the rated fighters. He's too young for sure, but I think in the near future he's going to be one of the best fighters of all time because he have a lot of determination. And like I said from the beginning, I expect a tough fight. That was it, you saw them in CBS.
All right, let's take a look at the knockout in this 14th round. It looked like 2 left hands hurt him, and then the right hand finally sent him down. Well, here's another look at it.
Well, that's the right hand and the belly, and the solar plate was the number 1 punch because I think Mancini is stronger than the head. But my trainer told me, you start hitting the belly because you need it, because you're slowing down the his speed, and that's what I started to do it from the 7 or 8 round.
You were very patient throughout the fight. Your experience, I think, played a great role in the fact that you were not flustered at any point, even though early in the fight he was doing well.
Beautiful. He was doing beautiful, but the main thing that I have is my condition and my resistance. I am a 15-round fighter. He's a 10-round fighter. It was what I expect. If he make me trouble in the beginning, I started controlling it in the late round because I knew it.
Alexis, you are truly one of the class champions in boxing. Ray Mancini, when this fight was made, was very respectful of you. He felt it was a privilege to fight you. You two guys have conducted yourselves wonderfully. You certainly are a credit to the sport of boxing, which has enough problems outside of the ring. You two guys are a credit to what it's all about. Here is the challenger, Ray Mancini. Come on in here.
Good.
That's what we're talking about.
Thank you, sir.
Ray Mancini.
I love your father. That's the most beautiful thing you have, like I have my father. Take good care of you. You're going to be a good promise. And I promise, if I can do something for you, let me know, please.
Thank you.
Okay?
It really was. And obviously, you can see even Ray Mancini Senior in his wheelchair ringside, and he's showing emotion because obviously, I think it was in World War II. I think he suffered from injuries in World War II where he could have become a world champion, and it was because of those injuries and having to go to World War II that he was unable to fulfill his potential and win a world title. So obviously, having Ray at this time fighting for a world title, and he was undefeated as well. But yet, Aguero just what he did. He would demolish people. When he got comfortable at lightweight, he was terrific. And obviously, Ray Mancini was a great fighter as well. He actually did go on the following year to win the WBA lightweight title. So, it just shows you how many guys did Aguero fought. It was just impressive. And it continued. I mean, we could keep going all day-ish on there, but, just jumping on to sort of into 1982, obviously, which is the year of the Pryor fight, and he fights Andrew Ganigan, who was a 34-3 fighter at the time. He got rid of him in 5. Another fight on YouTube. Aguero dropped him in the second round in one of his toughest fights in the division, and that's what he said. It was the fourth to last defence of the lightweight titles as well. And although he finished off Andrew Ganigan in 5, it was a tough 5-5. I think it was the first sort of 2-3 rounds. He had a real go, and he put him under pressure, which was probably. Maybe Aaron Pryor may have even looked at that fight and thought, well, he was a bit uncomfortable. Maybe that's something he could do. And we all know what Pryor was like. So, and then after that, he fought Kevin Rooney. We all know Kevin Rooney as the trainer, or he was a fantastic trainer for Mike Tyson. And we all know the ins and outs of how important Kevin Rooney was for Mike Tyson. And when he wasn't in the corner, he was a shadow of himself, Tyson, wasn't he? But, as a trainer, he's very well respected. The fighter he's a guy that, he was 19-1 at the time. He wasn't a world beater. I think the one and only defeat he had before the Aguero fight was against David Moore. But Rooney was trained by Customata and Teddy Atlas. So, he had an excellent corner. Just the fact was he just wasn't that good. And he ended in 2 rounds very quickly. It's definitely a fight you could have a look at. It's a devastating knockout. And that was when we eventually moved on to Mr. Aaron Pryor.
So this is it, the build-up for this particular legendary night then. So this was Arguello's attempt to become a 4-weight world champion. This was something that not often seen in boxing in that particular era. You see it a lot now. You've got Manny Pacquiao, 8-weight world champion in different divisions. Oscar De La Hoya, I think he was 4 or 5 weights. Floyd Mayweather. Many legendary names that'll go down as Hall of Famers with all these world titles. But this was 1982. And you didn't have that many people doing that. You had some of your other previous legends that we've spoke about in the past, but this was a period of time where not many people were doing something like this. And this was Arguello's attempt at becoming a 4-weight world champion.
You don't beat an Aaron Pryor, and you don't beat an Alexis Arguello until you absolutely destroy either fighter.
Who's the hungrier fighter, you think?
I don't know that at 1.6 and 1.5 million you can say anybody's hungry. Aaron Pryor wants a recognition. Alexis Arguello is fighting for history. That gives you a heck of an incentive that money can't.
This was actually billed as the Battle of Champions. Previously we had Aaron Pryor. He was going into this fight as the defending WBA super lightweight champion. And then obviously you had the former WBC lightweight champion. I believe he was still the WBC champion at the time, hence the word, the Battle of the Champions, being billed for this particular one. And I think when you look at this particular fight, and you listen to the careers that we've just given you a breakdown on there, I don't know who you would expect to be the betting favourite in this one. And I don't know what people's opinions would be on that. But actually, Aguero was the betting favourite at 12-5. He was the betting favourite for this particular fight because he was the guy that had moved up significantly through the weights. And I think when you look back at his career, and we've spoke about it in this episode, I can kind of understand now why, given what he'd done, and given that some of them opponents that he beat ended up going on to become world champions in their own right. So because of what he achieved, it just made you think, actually, yeah, he probably was the betting favourite, because Pryor, looking at his career and his resume up to this point, wasn't as significant. So that is probably why they put him as the betting favourite. And you look at the purses for the fight as well. Very, very similar purses. Pryor got $1.6 million for this, whereas Aguero's purse was $1.5 million. Very, very close. So it's practically like a 50-50 split. That's really close in terms of the purses. And again, not something you see very often, because you look at boxing and how boxing works. Usually you see, you know, fighters with the bigger draw, fighters that bring more of the crowd, or fighters that bring the TV with them as a result. But in this one, this was a fight between two very, very popular fighters that had made it. And this was a very, very close split purse, which, again, you don't really see a lot of in this day and age. And what was really, really good was the build-up to it in terms of the press conference. That particular press conference was amazing. And I think the legendary words that came from that was from a certain Mr. Bob Arum. So Bob Arum, in the press conference, basically goes on to say, you don't beat an Alexis Arguello, or you don't beat an Aaron Pryor until you absolutely destroy them.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. We put out on the little video for the preview, which we'll put out again when we do release it. But it really was great. And you know, even we put a bit of Bert Sugar in there, and Bert Sugar was, you could tell he was just over the moon. You know, the way you see it wasn't about the money. I mean, they're earning $1.5 million at the time. It's a ridiculous amount of money. 1982 just shows you. I mean, obviously the Fab Four, they were earning the big money. They were earning probably over that. But this was the first fight. You know, we've spoken about the money that Pryor was earning. He was doubling his money for this fight. He was a hungry fighter. He wanted that recognition. He wanted that big name. And this was it. This was it. This was the guy that was attempting to become a 4-weight world champion, which was unthinkable at the time. And I think the only person that eventually did do it is someone we've got in a career profile today, which is Thomas Hearns. He was the first boxer in history to ever do it. And Aguero was very close. If he'd have won this fight, it would have happened. Obviously, the fight as well, one thing to mention, it was at the Orange Bowl, which was in Miami, Florida. Very completely in Aguero's favour, even down to the announcement as well, which was Pryor. He did mention that he wasn't happy with the fact that the announcement had called him Alexis Arguello, Mr. Alexis Arguello, and he just called Pryor Aaron Pryor, and he wasn't happy with it from the off. And you can actually see it's very iconic, where Aguero was pissed off with it. I mean, not Aguero, sorry. Pryor was so pissed off with it that he's standing there looking at it just before they start. He's standing looking at Aguero, opposite corners, and just pointing at him, shaking his head. He's saying to him, "I'm gonna get you, and I'm gonna just shut this whole stadium up." And I think the one point to pick up is the fact that Aaron Pryor's team, they actually did try to push a 12-round fight. And you mentioned it earlier, Sean, and you were spot on that 15 rounds was Alexis Aguero, and he wanted 15 rounds, whereas Pryor obviously felt, if we get a 12-rounder, I could probably win it on points, and if not, stop him. Obviously, with being Pryor, he would have thought he would have stopped him. He was on his fantastic run as well. I think this is his 26th fight, or he had actually 25 knockouts, straight knockouts, and this was going to be his 26th. In the end, obviously, it ended up becoming a 15-rounder, and as you say, Battle of the Champions, everything was set up for this fight to be an absolute classic, and boy, did they deliver.
Well, this was also Pryor's 6th defence of that WBA title, And just a little story that I picked up in the research for this episode was that something I didn't know before. Now, I have watched this fight before doing the Legendary Nights episode, but I never knew that literally prior to them walking out to do the ring walks, that a man was detained trying to get into the dressing room of Alexis Arguello with a weapon, with a loaded weapon. Now, that was something that I completely didn't know about at all until you do the depths of the internet and you dig, and there's some fantastic articles out there about Alexis Arguello and his career, and Aaron Pryor in his career as well. But this was one that I didn't even know about, so you wouldn't have even thought that there was a crazed man trying to get into Alexis Arguello's dressing room literally minutes before he's about to do his ring walk. And yet, when he comes out and you watch it and you get him in the ring and you get the announcements, he's as cool as a cucumber. He's just like, yep, just going to carry on. But this was a guy that obviously had seen it all, done it all, and was ready to try and do it all again. So this is it then. This is the Legendary Night, the tale of Pryor versus Aguero. The fight itself, amazing. It's the first word I'm going to use to describe this fight. Amazing. So the first round of the fight was absolutely crazy. Frantic. Pryor literally sprinting out of the blocks like he's Usain Bolt, going to centre ring, going there to get the centre ring straight away. And he wasn't afraid in this fight, Aaron Pryor, as he wasn't in his whole career, was to take a few, to give a few. And that was what he was all about. And this is what he did in the first round. He tries to take centre ring from Aguero, who was happy to sit on the back foot and counterpunch. And both of them in that first round landed significant punches enough to hurt each other. And that was, you knew you were going to have a good fight from that first round.
Aaron Pryor has been known to charge out at the opening bell. Round one. Pryor with the first punch. He scores with the right hand. Up tempo right from the opening bell.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if someone gets knocked down in the first round.
Pryor, perpetual motion. He is right on top of Arguello, who gets off the ropes. Crowd already starting to cheer. Arguello with the right hand that scores on Pryor, whose legs buckle for a moment.
Pryor seems to be hurt. Alex went to the body and was able to hurt Pryor for a while.
Which is exactly what Larry Merchant was just mentioning.
Those uppercuts by Alex and that overhand right is very effective in Pryor's style.
Pryor is now slowed down just for the moment. Pryor has been knocked down. He will say, yes, I'll get knocked down and take a count of 1, 2, or 3, but my opponent will get knocked down and take a count of 8, 9, or 10. And that has been the story.
Oh, it was a ferocious pace, wasn't it? And Pryor obviously pissed off with the announcer, desperate to get the big name, and he literally threw out the box, and Aguero, to his credit, he fought back. You know, Aguero's not one to take a step back. He will try to take the centre of the ring. So I think they both attempted to push each other back, and I think for me, Pryor was the one who just got the better of the exchanges, and he just threw some of the bigger bombs, I suppose, because they were throwing big, heavy shots. And the second round was pretty much the same. For me, I thought Aguero landed the cleaner shots in the second, although Pryor was throwing more. And you know, the crowd were on their feet. You could hear the crowd. It was just unbelievable. Like the atmosphere and the fight itself was just crazy. And it was actually in after the second round as well, which is something I didn't realise. Like, amount of times I've watched this fight, I can't even tell you, because it's just a brilliant fight. I mean, people talk about Hagler Hearns, you know, Gatti Ward. This is one of these fights where, you know, the first round, the second round, it's a constant. Very rarely you have them stepping back. They will go at each other, they'll be on each other's chest. But technically they're astute, and they're just masterclass really at times. Although they're willing, as you say, to take a shot. And Aguero's looking to be his normal patient self, and Pryor was not allowing him to do that. And it was actually the second round that Panama Lewis actually says, "Give me that bottle, the bottle that I mixed."
Give me that drink that I mix. One that I mix.
And I didn't realise at the time, because I know it happens later on. So in the second round, he actually gives him the bottle. So we will talk about the bottle later on. But yeah, the bottle that he mixed, he give him in the second round. And then obviously the third round, again, exactly the same.
So it's an interesting first half of the fight. You know, the first 6 rounds, 7 rounds are interesting in the sense that it's Aaron Pryor's aggressiveness against the counter-punching skills of the slick fighter that was Alexis Arguello. And if you're watching that fight and you're trying to score it, it's difficult. You've got to kind of give it what you like in this particular fight. And for me, watching this fight back, I was looking at Aaron Pryor sort of taking the first, not every single round in that first sort of 6-7 rounds, but I think he took a good chunk of them rounds, more so on the aggressiveness. He did land quite a few clean shots, but then Arguello did also land quite a few clean shots when he was counterpunching, so it did make it difficult to kind of sit back and really try to score it. So I sat there and I thought to myself, you know, this was literally a tale of two halves with this particular fight, because we refer back to the previous conversations in the episode about Alexis Arguello's being the stamina and the endurance and the guy that wants to go 15 rounds. It was scheduled for the 15 rounds, and you kind of knew going into the sort of second half of the fight, Aguero was going to pick it up. Aguero did actually get a cut on his eye on the 6th round as well. If he didn't pick that up in the fight, he did actually get a cut in the 6th round. But again, it was a really frantic pace, and you mentioned about the black bottle, the controversy of the black bottle, which we'll come on to in a bit more detail shortly. That obviously makes you think to yourself, was there something in it? I wonder. Well, we'll go into that in a few moments. In between rounds, obviously, smelling salts were allowed back then. In the 80s, they were allowed to use the smelling salts, that given that sort of... It was like, basically, when you go through a field, a farmer's field, and you drive past it with your windows down and you smell horse shit, and it basically says... Your dad would say to you, oh God, that'll put hairs on your chest. Breathe that one in, that'll clear your lungs. That was what smelling salts were, basically, for anybody that doesn't know what they were. That was what it was like. So it'd give you that sort of extra air and oxygen into your lungs to give you a little bit more capacity in them. So that it essentially looked like it made you come out feeling a bit more and looking a bit more refreshed. So you go into the second half of the fight then, and Arguello's starting to pick him off a little bit now. So he's starting to land them counter punches. He's sticking to his game plan, and he's starting to land them counter punches, and it makes it more interesting. It makes it more of an interesting fight, because then you start to see Aaron Pryor, he does start to slow a little bit in that second half of the fight. Between rounds 9 and 11, you start to see Alexis Arguello come into the fight more, and this is where you think to yourself watching it, this is where Arguello now can take over the fight. This is what becomes significant for Arguello, in his history tells us that. So second half of the fight then, Johnston, this is where we move into a big part of the episode, and obviously the controversial part of this particular legendary night.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, Pryor, he came out from the off, burst off straight on Aguero's chest. And I think for me, what Aguero did do really, really masterfully, if you like, and very clever in terms of he fought at distance, and because he had the perfect range, Aguero was just a bit bewildered with it. And for the first time in his career, he actually sort of see Aguero sort of struggling to respond, and his movement and combinations, especially like you mentioned the 6th round, there's a fantastic combination that Pryor does. He throws a sort of a right and then ducks under the shot and twists and moves Aguero around. It's just class, and it is just a beautiful combination. And then obviously moving in, as you say, into the second half of the fight, where Aguero is starting to find his shots, he's starting to find his rhythm now, he's starting to close the gap. And he's in the 8th round where he throws a 3-punch combination that, you know, it's a beautiful combo, and some big right hands are now landing. And as you say, Pryor seems like he's starting to tire. And the 9th round is an amazing round where Aguero lands a great left uppercut and then a right cross, and then ends it with a left uppercut to the body, and then follows it with a right cross. It's like a 4-punch combo that's just beautiful. And Pryor would sort of come back in the last 30 seconds or so, landing successfully with left and rights. But, I mean, that 9th round was a brilliant round. And then another round is obviously the 11th round. Aguero he sort of takes the centre. He does take the centre ring in the 11th round. Pryor can't really stop him from marching forward, whereas before he was able to land some of the big shots, and Aguero would back off slightly, where he couldn't sort of withstand the amount of shots. I wouldn't necessarily say the power, although they did obviously hurt him. But Aguero he was landing these spiteful shots with his right hand, and in particular was a thunderous shot, and is a devastating shot that I still don't know how Pryor doesn't go down from it. And there's another one later on in the round, but this in the 11th is a big shot, and it actually makes his head bobble about a bit. Pryor showing that he's also got a fantastic granite chin as well, up until sort of in that 11th round, and then as we go into the later stages of the fight.
There's a hard right hand by Arguello, but Pryor did not take one step back. Tough kid.
Those were some devastating punches by Alex Arguello.
So then, let's go to it. Let's go to the bit that people are probably thinking, what are their thoughts on this? What are they going to talk about with this? The black bottle, the infamous black bottle. Panama Lewis, as we know him now, he was a bit of an arsehole, really, weren't he? I mean, you watch that documentary about Louis Resto and Billy Collins, and it's called Assault in the Ring documentary. It's really, really sad watch, to be honest with you. Panama Lewis is the focal point of that, but this was another instance here where he's got this black bottle, as you said earlier on in the fight, second round, and he's saying, no, give me that bottle, the black bottle, the one I mixed. So between rounds 13 and 14, it happens again. This is more prominent now. It's picked up more so on the audio than ever. It's quite loud, actually, at this point. You can literally hear the guy say, no, the one I mixed, that black bottle, the one I... And you're thinking to yourself, what's in that bottle? What is in that bottle? What is he giving him in that bottle? Why does he want that bottle?
Punch back! Win these 2 last rounds! 6 minutes! You can fight for 6 minutes? Give me that bottle. The one I mixed.
And it becomes more evident as you go into the 14th round because, as you were just rightly pointing out, Pryor's starting to get a little bit spent now. He's taking more hard shots. Arguello's starting to hurt him more. Yes, he's still in the fight. Yes, he's still dangerous himself. But you're thinking this is Arguello's territory. Aguero, the amount of times he'd stopped fighters in the 13th round, going into the 14th round, he'd stopped Mancini in the 14th round. So, was this going to be the round? Well, no, it wasn't, because history tells us now that Aaron Pryor, for events unknown, somehow manages to come back in this round. And whether it is something to do with that black bottle, we'll talk about that in a few moments. But the fight ended when he came out with an absolute burst. So he battered him from pillar to post in the first minute of that round. He just knocked him around the ring like it was glorified sparring. It was a bit crazy to watch because you've watched this whole fight and you're thinking, if you'd not seen it before, you're looking at it thinking, Arguello, surely now this is it. This is going to be the round. Pryor's spent. He's done. He's blown out of his ass. Surely this is going to be it now. But then he comes out and he basically batters him around the ring and ends up landing a combination and then getting him onto the ropes where he's seemingly hurt. And then he ends up landing, I think it's around 15 to 20 unanswered shots from Pryor onto Arguello, which prompts the referee, the legendary Stanley Christodoulou, to step in and call halt to the fight, with Aaron Pryor seemingly on the verge of what could have been a defeat and turns it round into a victory. And then you've got a sad image of Aguero sort of slumped over the ropes, and Pryor wins and he defends the title.
Pryor a left jab and a combination again, and Aguero's in trouble. Aguero in big trouble against the ropes. Pryor going for the kill, trying to put him away. Aguero trying to cover up. A smashing right hand. Aguero's helpless against the ropes. Aguero's hands at his side. It's over. Aaron Pryor has retained his junior welterweight championship. Arguello slips to the canvas.
Yeah, and you know, that I mean, I mentioned the shot with that 11th round. In the 13th round, just before he goes back to the corner to Panama Lewis, where he gives him this mysterious mixed bottle, he gets caught with one almighty right hand from Alexis Arguello. I mean, even Pryor says, when he hit me, he said, my head flew right back, and he just looked, all he could see was the lights on top of the ring, literally, and he just shot his head back down and he just carried on fighting. How on earth he managed to stand on his feet, Aaron Pryor, after taking that right hand, and as we said, how devastating that right hand was in terms of what he did with southpaws. I mean, I know Pryor was an orthodox fighter, although he could switch up a little bit, but wow, unbelievable. And that shot was so ferocious and solid, and as you say, the 13th round, it was like a calling for Aguero. That 13th round was like his round. It was like the Aguero round, if you like, and Pryor looked like a beaten man. He really did, and it was like a matter of time. And obviously, this bottle, this mysterious bottle, and you know, whatever was in it, we'll never know. But it did come out like it was clear as something was given to him, because he come out like as fresh as a daisy, like the first round. But one thing I will say is the finish is unbelievable. I love to throw that word in, but it's one of the best finishes I've ever seen in a boxing ring. the combination of shots is just, it's ridiculous. It's left and right, to the head, to the body. Will go to the body, then will go back to the head, and Aguero's just, he can't stop him. It's a barrage of shots, and his hands, in the end, his hands are gone. He takes, I think, the last 3 or 4 to the chin. How on earth Alexis Aguero is still on his feet when the referee jumps in? I will never know. But obviously the referee waves it off, and as he does, as you say, he realises that, and he just slumps onto the ropes. But yeah, it was a great fight. But the one thing that marred the fight is the controversial mixed bottle. And I mean, what was in it? This is the biggest question, and this is why this has become a legendary night of two towns, because we do move on to the second. But the aftermath of this fight was interesting, because after that fight, Aaron Pryor was supposed to have a drug test. And it was to do with the fact that Bob Arum said that he came into the ring when Aguero was on the deck. He was sort of slumped on the ropes, and he's come in I can't remember if it was CBS. I can't remember the other one of the other TV networks. But the guy that came in to do the interviews was trying to get an interview with Alexis Aguero, and basically Bob Arum says, "Look at Alexis. He's on the floor," and he sort of just puts him right a bit, has a little word in his ear. And apparently this reporter, I don't know who he is, what his name is, but apparently he chased Bob Arum around the ring. Bob Arum's running away from this geezer because he's got to write up because he can't get a flavoured interview. But anyway, Aaron Pryor says, apparently this is Bob Arum's story, so Aaron Pryor sort of is in the ring and he goes, "Oh, I'm getting out of here because they've got a nutcase in the ring." And he runs off to the change room, gets himself changed, and he leaves. But he was supposed to have a drugs test, and he didn't have the drugs test. So that is another problem. So not only do we know what was in the mixed bottle, I mean, I'm sure I've got a few things down. I'll let you say what you discovered, Sean. And he didn't have the drug test that he was supposed to have.
Regarding the black bottle, then, I think if you look at the Louis Resto case with Billy Collins and the documentary Assault in the Ring, you look at what Louis Resto talks about in this one. So that documentary is about padding being ripped out of the gloves. This instance is about the black bottle. He was saying that basically there was 2 different mixtures that used to go in the bottles that Panama Louis used to make. One of them was basically crushed up antihistamines. So them antihistamines are used to basically get your lung capacity up, get your oxygen levels up, so you are breathing in more oxygen, which then essentially pumps the blood around your body more, which gives you that little bit more energy, basically, because your body's working 10 times harder than what it needs to be. You get that extra oxygen, makes your heart pump faster and as quick as it needs to get the blood around your body. So that's the one thing. The second one was peach schnapps. Apparently you used to put peach schnapps into the into the black bottles as well. That is according to Louis Resto, by the way. This is Louis Resto's words. So whether that's true, the antihistamine one, I can definitely believe that. I definitely believe that was the case. Basically, given the sort of the way it works and the way it helps the body work, yeah, definitely agree. I think that was it. So the aftermath of it then, what happens then? Obviously, there's the black bottle incident. There's the fact that there's no drugs test taken. So logically, they're going to want a rematch, right? Of course they are. But it doesn't happen straight away. What I found strange about it is why it wasn't immediate, because Aguero would actually end up having 2 fights before the rematch would actually take place, which I found quite strange, to be honest with you, why it never became an immediate one. But the aftermath of it, I can't stress enough how much of a black mark, no pun intended, about the black bottle this has left on Pryor's career. Because this is his legendary night, this is his defining night, but it is always marred with the controversy over the black bottle.
He came up and asked me, did I have anything in the black bottle? This is why I took the second fight with him and why I tore him apart.
In the most anticipated rematch since the Thriller in Manila between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, Alexis Arguello and Aaron Pryor will again go to war.
And it really is, and obviously Panama Louis, he was banned for the second fight because of, was it the Resto? Did Resto happen just after? I think it happened just after, before. Was it in between the fights, or I don't know if it was that, or if he was banned for something else. But Panama Louis ended up getting banned for the second fight, and Aaron Pryor actually brought in, I believe it was Emmanuel Stewart. Yeah, so either way, yeah, as you say, I mean, how on earth they didn't have the immediate aftermath straight away onto the fight, I don't know. Everybody's saying it was clearly something wrong with the bottle. For one, it's a black bottle. You can't see why would you have it as a black bottle? Because obviously, clearly, it's going to be like a cloudy colour, isn't it? And you can clearly see there's something here. Either way, Panama Lewis is just an absolute robber. Let's get it right. And he was sentenced to prison for the Resto situation. I think him and Resto both went down as well, didn't they, for what happened after. But either way, he's just an awful person, really. He just wanted to get an advantage, and it worked for him. Saying that, they finally did get the aftermath. And Alexis Arguello, as we've already said, being the gentleman he was, he actually went and spoke to Aaron Pryor himself and said to him, did you have anything in the bottle? And Pryor said, no, there was nothing in the bottle, it was just water. And that was it. Aguero took his word for it, and he accepted it, and he said, fine, you beat me, you was the better man, let's do it again.
So that's what was going to happen next, of course. For Aaron Pryor, he would defend his title one more time before the rematch against Sang-Hyun Kim. So he would defend that title in April of 1983, and it was September of 1983, the 9th of September 1983, the rematch was set. But sometimes rematches don't always go the way the first fights went. I think I'd love to see statistics about fights and the rematches of fights and about how statistically better they were, because this one wasn't nowhere near as good as the tale of Pryor versus Aguero #1, because Aguero looked like he didn't have it in him anymore. He didn't look like he had the heart to be in the ring anymore, and that was the sad part about watching the second fight, is that when you watch the aftermath of what this first fight led, it was a bit of a downward spiral for both of them, to be honest with you. I mean, in the ring, they had the successes, of course, and we can touch on that briefly, but outside the ring, it wasn't always as successful, and it wasn't always as good as what it should have been. Aaron Pryor wouldn't go down the route he wanted to go down. Alexis Arguello wouldn't go down the route he wanted to go down. And you heard the intro at the beginning of the episode. You heard a particular song being played from the 1980s period called White Lines. Well, let's have no guesses as to what that actually refers to in that song. It's a famous song. I think we all know what it's all about. And we also know what their careers aftermaths also went down as well. Let's just talk a little bit about the aftermath then. Obviously, the second fight, I'm not sort of going to touch too much into it. I think it wasn't as good as the first. Aaron Pryor, same old Aaron Pryor, came out and destroyed Alexis Arguello in 10 rounds. Wasn't as good. Alexis Arguello's heart wasn't there, and this left this tarnished legacy of Aaron Pryor, who would obviously then go on to have further fights and actually pick up a loss in his career later on down the line. But subsequently, that was because he was in and out of the ring. He was having issues with drugs problems, with cocaine, and he was having issues getting himself motivated for fights. So after the Aguero fight, he would then go on to win the IBF super lightweight title and then defend it before then getting his only loss on his record to Bobby Joe Young. He would eventually go on to fight 3 more times, ending his career in 1990 after he had an issue with the vision and was denied a boxing license, and that was the end of Aaron Pryor's career. Alexis Arguello's career, slightly different. Obviously, he would go on to have fights as well after the match, and he would actually go on to have one more big win in his career against Billy Costello in 1986, before having a hiatus from the ring for 8 years, coming back in 94, getting a majority victory over Jorge Palmares, and then losing in his final fight to Scott Walker in 1995. So that was the fighting careers inside the ring. That was what they did after this major fight, the legendary night that we've covered. But I think outside the ring is where I want to touch on mostly, because I've alluded to the fact that there was issues with cocaine going on, and it did happen for both of them. Both of them ended up becoming addicted to cocaine at some point throughout their lives, which was a big part in their lives and a bit of a downfall at times for them.
Yeah, it wasn't, and it was a good fight. It was a good fight. It wasn't nowhere near legendary, but it was a good night. Good night's worth of action, and Aguero went down a few times. But yeah, as you say, after the fight, both of them had their problems. Alexis Arguello briefly had a problem with cocaine. It wasn't as bad as Aaron Pryor. He had these moments where I think a lot of the time with these great legends, and even just fighters in general, they end up sort of going off on a bit of a tandem, I suppose, after their careers, and they dabble in certain things, maybe down to the fact that once these guys have finished their careers, they've taken a lot of beating, whether it be in sparring and in the ring. I'm guessing it's a mental problem rather than anything else, and who they surround themselves with. They got a big purse as well for the second fight. Pryor got 2.5 million and Aguero got 1.75 million. So it was two of the biggest purses. I think it was definitely Aaron Pryor's biggest purse at the end of his career. And Pryor, though, he was hooked on cocaine. He was massively hooked on it, cocaine and crack. He actually blamed, he spent a lot of his time blaming a lot of other people, and he blamed his girlfriend. He said it was his wife that got him hooked on drugs, and I believe it was the same wife that shot him back in 1980 something. She shot him in the arm when she was his fiance. She shot him in the arm. Police came to Pryor's residence and they sent her away, and she's sort of saying, I'm married to him and we're going to adopt a kid, or I'm going to have a kid. And Pryor's like, no, we're not married. We're not adopting no kid. And in the end, he ends up marrying her. So there's a lot about Aaron Pryor, but he sort of ended up on the streets in the 90s. It just took over. It literally took over for him to the point where he was on the street. There was even a point where I read and heard that he was actually taking like $10 from guys because he was so sort of smashed out of his face. He's sort of hollering and shouting in the streets about, I'm the world champion. You know, you can imagine. He went down to, his weight was down to nothing. He was as skinny as anything, wasn't eating. And guys were actually giving him $10 to have a fight so they could beat him up, and he would take the $10 just so he can go and get himself some more crack cocaine. And it was just a mess. And it was actually Tim Weatherspoon, who was a massive fan of Aaron Pryor. Tim Weatherspoon was the heavyweight that was, he adored Pryor. I think Tim Weatherspoon may have been from Cincinnati himself, and he actually pulled Pryor in, and he said, come on, I'm your biggest fan, come and just be a part of my entourage. And he was charismatic, he had high energy, and he wanted him to be around him. So that was what turned Pryor around, and he managed to get sort himself out and get off the drugs. But there's a great quote from Aaron Pryor. There's so many as well. I don't think there's many videos, but there's a lot of stuff out there on the web where you could read about some of his quotes. But there's one quote which it's terrible, but it did make me chuckle. And he actually said when he was so high that he was getting nicked all the time, and he said, "Please God, take this taste away," but it never went away. Never, 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 never. I just thought, you can't feel sorry for the poor fella. And I credit that quote to Crime in Sport, who's another podcast that I do listen to, and I want to put a shout out to them. They actually do a great backdrop of whole of Aaron Pryor's career. Obviously, more to do with his crime than his sport, but they're the ones that I found this quote from. And do check it out. If you're an Aaron Pryor fan, have a listen. It's a great listen. And obviously, listen to this and watch the fight. Give us our feedback. But yeah, Aaron Pryor cleaned himself up, and he actually did end up getting inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1996, and also Aguero got inducted. He was actually called one of the greatest junior lightweights ever by Houston Boxing Hall of Fame in 2014. But he was inducted in the Hall of Fame. I haven't got a date here, but I'm sure he was at some point as well.
So, in terms of Arguello's aftermath, obviously we touched on a little bit of his issues with cocaine. He did actually enter politics in Nicaragua. He ended up going back and being the face of the party that ended up getting him exiled in the late 1970s, which was strange. When I read up on his career and I looked at the Sandinista National Liberal Front, they was actually the party he ended up representing when he went back all the years later. He ended up in politics. He was obviously a hero, the way Duran is in Panama. He was like the same sort of level of love for him. But things would obviously take a dark turn for Alexis Arguello, because at the age of 57, he decided to take his own life by shooting and killing himself. So that was a sad end to the tale, really, of Alexis Arguello's life. This was a guy that was well loved by everybody, and it got that dark for him and deep for him that he unfortunately decided to take his own life and died at the age of 57 in 2009.
Just to butt in, I do have to say, when I did read that, and I thought he's in politics, and all of a sudden he's a part of that party, and then he shoots himself in the heart, I don't know, I think that's a little bit sus for me. I just thought I'd just throw that in there, because I don't know, I'm not too sure about that. I think there might be a little bit more to that than meets the eye.
Conspiracies in boxing. That's certainly something that could certainly discuss down the line. Definitely. Yeah. As I was going into Aaron Pryor, obviously we talked about Aaron Pryor's career. We did sort his life out. Ended up becoming a Christian minister. Ended up getting inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame, as you rightly pointed out there. And unfortunately, he also passed away at the age of 60 years old in 2016, and that was due to heart disease. This particular fight then, ending it on a positive note, of course, and not a sour note of them passing away.
Yeah.
Ending this on a positive note. This fight was so significant to boxing. It really was so significant to boxing. This fight goes up against any of them big fights that we've spoke about earlier and that we've done legendary nights on. It is up there as one of them. So much so that it was named the fight of the decade by the Ring magazine of the 1980s. And you're talking about Hagler-Hearns. Hagler-Hearns was in that decade as well, and this was named the fight of the decade in the 1980s. So that just goes to show how much it was well thought of, above some of them amazing fights that happened throughout the 1980s as well. In 1996, it was also named the 8th greatest fight of all time throughout all weight categories. And this was obviously a long time ago now, so we're now in 2020, but in 1996, it was voted the 8th greatest fight of all time. There's not been too many more fights that have happened since that would kind of push it too far out of, say, the top 20. It was amazing fight, an amazing night, and so significant to boxing, but also marred with so much controversy that it leaves a lasting legacy that isn't always the lasting legacy it should have done. In terms of its pure will, skill, heart and determination from both men and both men's careers, it certainly give us one of the great legendary nights that we've really enjoyed covering. Amazing pick by yourself, Johnston, and it's been an absolute pleasure to cover this one.
Oh, it's just a absolutely stunning fight, and one that, as I say, I always went back to. And what an amazing! We were doing the Chow, as I say. The second wasn't as good. The first, I'm not surprised he got a fight. Actually, I am. I assumed it was going to be Hagler-Hearns for the fight of the decade. I suppose it's only 3 rounds. This is, 14 rounds, a stunning 14 rounder, and what can you say? It was just a classic and one that I've always enjoyed and always loved to watch, and just with the incident as well, it just adds to it, doesn't it? But two legends of the sport. I mean, I'm a massive Alexis Arguello fan. I haven't hidden the fact that I am, and he is a great fighter of mine, and I hope one day we'll get a career profile on him. And Aaron Pryor, I mean, the guy was, he was just a great character, wasn't he? And, what time is it? Halt time. And you see all the videos, no idea what the hell I'm saying there. It was just a slogan he always used to say, and he always had his entourage following him. And, two excellent fighters, world-class fighters, legendary fighters, created a legendary night.
It certainly did. So if you've enjoyed this legendary night, of course, you can now follow us on our own Legendary Nights podcast. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker. Anywhere you want to find us, we are there. Legendary Nights, give it a search. It now has its own independent podcast feed as part of BTR Boxing Podcast. Please get on there, subscribe, and please rate and review it, because this will truly help get the Legendary Nights series well and truly off the ground. So if you've also enjoyed listening to our thoughts and our take on this legendary night, you can go and find us on social media at BTR Boxing Pod on Twitter and BTR Boxing Podcast on Facebook as well. Please go and check out some of our other series. We've got career profiles, we've got ones to watch, and we've got the main BTR Boxing Podcast feed with all the great big fight previews and reaction shows, as well as our one-off specials. So thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you've really enjoyed the tale of Aaron Pryor versus Alexis Arguello.
And right now, Thomas Hearns is an open book for Ray Leonard. Backs up against the ropes.
This is one of the most unusual calls by a referee in the history of the sport.
The first loss, a tremendous victory